Enshrouded's world is rich with lore, but unless you've read through most of the hundreds of scattered lore notes in the game, you'd probably never know. By the time we the player have entered the land of Embervale, around 20 to 30 years have passed since a series of catastrophic events spelled ruin for this world. A deadly shroud now fills the valleys, and towns and cities have become reduced to rubble. Very few signs of life remain, except for wildlife, and these crazed scavengers. And because of this, the vast majority of the lore in the game is communicated to you by reading the letters and journals left behind by those who lived through this land's downfall. And there are hundreds of these notes. But this lore isn't just relevant to understanding Embervale's past. It also reveals the key characters you should be looking out for in future updates, and the game's 1.0 release. So what exactly happened to bring Embervale to ruin? Well, to understand that, we have to go back. Decades before the game begins, when this land was a thriving kingdom ruled by Queen Pikemead, with its capital at Pikemead's Reach, in the Revelwood. Queen Pikemead seems to have been widely adored by her subjects, and by all accounts, under her rule the kingdom flourished. The queen had 3 children, the eldest Vorgoth, then Gormander, and lastly Jezmina. At some point, Queen Pikemead met her end, and was laid to rest at Mistbury Catacombs. You can visit her tomb yourself, just east of the farmer's ancient vault. At the entrance there is a riddle, which should help you find each of the 4 hidden buttons to the Queen's tomb. The riddle also contains a few hints about the fate of the Queen's children, and the title itself refers to the Queen and her children in age order. 1 to glory, 1 to ice, 1 to rule, and 1 to life. Following the Queen's demise, for some reason, the kingdom seemed to become fractured. Gormander became king in the capital, grand patron of the Revelwood and Springlands, while Jezmina became queen of the Kindle Waste to the east. Most oddly, the eldest son, Vorgoth, seems to have been completely overlooked, and was sent to the north, which includes the Albanese summits, and possibly this northernmost region, not currently in the game. Instead of becoming a king, he was left with the lesser title of Lord Vorgoth, Guard of the North. Now comes the part that you're probably most familiar with, the event shown in the cutscene at the start of the game, which shows a mysterious wanderer presenting a rather noble figure with a bottle of blue liquid. A weapon, he calls it. A cure. This is of course the Elixir, a powerful resource that currently lied untapped deep under the earth, hidden away by the ancients. The scene continues as the figure drinks the elixir, instantly surging with its energy and newfound power. Given the eagle imagery here, I think it's pretty safe to assume that this figure is Lord Vorgoth. While not shown in this cutscene, we know from a number of other notes scattered across Embervale that the mysterious wanderer also told a number of regular folk about the elixir. For some, the wanderer appeared as a dream or a vision, for others in person, telling them of the great power and wealth that the elixir would bring them, and to dig. One of these notes that will prove important later on mentions how the mysterious wanderer was spotted heading towards a town called Glennwood's End, which will come back into the story later on. Elixir wells were constructed across the land, digging up the delicate fungi that could then be distilled into the elixir. But it soon became clear that there were unwanted side effects of this new industry. A thin mist seeped from the chasms dug into the earth, burning the eyes and lungs of the workers, and causing headaches. This mist is the beginnings of the Shroud, a deadly cloud that would soon cover most of Embervale. But the necessity and greed for the elixir was deemed to be worth these adverse effects, and wells continue to be developed across the land. Before we go any further, I just wanted to clarify for everyone what the elixir and the Shroud are, how they're both connected, and also how they're both very distinct things that lead to different but both very horrible outcomes. The elixir is a distilled substance made from the flesh of these tiny delicate fungi that, initially at least, were only growing deep underground. In-game you can loot this elixir from chests or scavengers, or just find it out in the world at various locations. And it can be pretty handy too. Consuming a bottle will grant you a powerful 30% damage multiplier for 30 minutes, but if you talk to the alchemist Balthazar while carrying a bottle of elixir, he will warn you of the long-term dangers of the substance. Notes found in-game reveal that prolonged use enhances strength, numbs fear, and gradually causes severe brain damage. Eventually, users lose the ability to perform daily tasks, care for themselves, their homes, or even communicate properly. The scavengers you encounter across Embervale are the result of extreme elixir addiction, completely consumed by their desire for more. The Shroud, on the other hand, is actually just a side effect of the wells constructed to produce the elixir. According to Balthazar's notes, the Shroud are fungal spores, the reproductive units by which fungi multiply, much like the seeds of a plant. In constructing these wells, digging deep into the earth, these spores were able to escape, spreading through the air and clinging to fur, skin, the eyes, the airways, seeking new hosts. Unlike the elixir, the infection process of the Shroud is very subtle. Victims don't realize they're infected, but behind the scenes, the spores are tapping into their brains and altering their behavior, gradually taking more and more control, until the host is nothing but a husk of their former selves, a foot soldier in the Shroud organism's army. Once infected, these beings are known as Fel, and it's not just humans. The Shroud also infects animals too, from boars to vultures, and even some larger animals that we'll talk about later on. A recent Reddit AMA with the developers detailed the infection's progression and how that is shown in the variety of Fel we can find in the Shroud. Earlier on, the infected are still physically powerful and highly aggressive, and act as a kind of defense mechanism for the Shroud. But in the later stages, when the fungi has devoured more and more of the host's bodies, they become a lot less mobile, and are more or less just looking for somewhere to lie down and go full mushroom. Near the elixir wells, the Shroud was clearly affecting the air quality and health of the workers. However, it turns out this corruption was not just limited to the air. The Shroud was also spreading through the ground and into the soil and water, causing environmental disasters far and wide in Embervale. In the Kendall waste to the east, the waters receded, leading to widespread drought and famine throughout the region. While in Pikemead's reach, the town flooded with an odd-tasting water, and the soil became weak, causing the walls to crumble and massive landfalls nearby. It also had an effect on the wildlife and non-human inhabitants of Embervale. The Vuka, which are these big, ferocious Ewok-looking things, were noted to be abandoning their deep caves and taking new territory throughout the Revelwood and Springlands, leading them to interact with humans much more often, and that often didn't go too well for the humans. These struggles were causing growing resentment in the capital. People could tell that something had changed, that trouble was brewing, and many saw King Gormander as too indecisive or just unwilling to confront these problems. And Gormander definitely doesn't seem to have been the best ruler. It's clear from various notes that you can find that he very much lived in the shadow of his mother's legacy, consumed by jealousy over the adoration she still commanded. While his people worried about the strange natural occurrences and rising tensions, Gormander had other priorities, renaming the Imperial Gardens after himself, commissioning statues in his honor, embezzling funds to fill his treasury, and, allegedly, indulging in lavish entertainment with courtesans. One of Gormander's greatest critics was the Pike Weekly editor, Ramone Jones, whose notes you can find scattered across Pikemead's reach. King Gormander obviously didn't look too fondly on this, and Ramone was accused of treason, forcing the editor into hiding, and we'll circle back to Ramone in a bit. Back in the summits, Lord Vorgoth is expanding his Elixir Wells operations, even shutting down the marble quarry, likely to redirect workers to the wells. The blacksmith Oswald mentions that Vorgoth's northern soldiers were busy forging weapons and armor to defend these wells. But defending them from who? It's possible that Vorgoth, deep in his elixir addiction, had grown paranoid that someone would try and take the wells from him. Maybe even his own brother, King Gormander. But there were also more immediate threats. Across Embervale, people were becoming crazed by the elixir. Workers suffering from the Shroud's effects began turning to the elixir for relief. But, of course, this quickly turned to dependency, and some resorted to raiding wells or completely abandoning their post to set out and establish their own wells. And outside of the Enshrouded areas, away from the wells, Vorgoth also had other issues. Just as the Shroud spores had seeped through the ground in the south, in the north they had found their way into the mountain, and infected a long-dormant dragon egg. At this time, dragons had been long extinct in Embervale. In the Kendall waste, the only traces of their existence are these enormous fossilized ribs, their true nature long forgotten by all but a few shaman. But high up in the mountains of the Albaneve summits, the skeletal remains are much more well preserved, very cool to see and fly through. And unlike in the Kendall wastes, they're very clearly dragons. It's probably because of this that dragons seemingly remained a stronger part of the folklore in the summits. Across the region, you can find several notes and poems that speak about dragons, and some of these notes even mention a dormant dragon egg hidden deep in the mountain. An egg which, thanks to the elixir wells, the Shroud was able to corrupt, and hatch from it a fell dragon. This fell dragon hatchling wreaked havoc across the Albanese summits, attacking settlements, damaging fortresses, and scaring the living daylights out of Vorgoth soldiers. This fell dragon is of course the fell dragon youngling that we fight at Howling Peak decades later. The next we hear about Lord Vorgoth is from notes written by Athelan the Hunter, who it seems once served Vorgoth in the Northern Army before deserting and fleeing to Revelwood. Deep in the Shroud, west of Pikemead's Reach, you can find a letter she had written to her brother, Talion, a commander in Lord Vorgoth's army. She tells her brother how Lord Vorgoth has gone mad to the Shroud, and how he is lying, saying that King Gormander is a threat. She tells Talion how she escaped Howling Peak and made for Revelwood, and urges her brother to do the same. But sadly, the letter never made it to Talion, as the bird carrying the message was shot down. This letter contains some pretty interesting details about the early stages of the war, and about Vorgoth, who we really don't know too much about at this time. The letter seems to imply that perhaps Vorgoth had summoned his northern army, and announced his intent to march south towards the capital. While we know the conflict between the northern and southern kingdoms came to be known as the Elixir Wars, the exact spark that ignited it remains unclear. Perhaps it was Vorgoth's growing fear of losing control of the wells, or a deepening obsession with securing more elixir, that ultimately pushed him to war with his siblings. Yet, if Athelan's claim is true, that Vorgoth's mind had succumbed to the Shroud, not the elixir, then his actions and motives may no longer have been his own. Instead, he would have been nothing more than a vessel, a puppet controlled by the Shroud hive mind, driven by a new purpose, to spread the Shroud and consume all in its path. But how exactly would Vorgoth have become enthralled by the Shroud? Was he down there digging away with the workers? I tend to think not. Well, there might actually be a clue in the item description for the Guard of the North Pants, which can be found in a chest in Pikemead's Reach. Talking about Lord Vorgoth, the note reads, "Legends say he was consumed by the Shroud, after the ancients pushed him off Howling Peak's summit." Reading this, it seems like it might be talking about the end of Vorgoth's story, that after the war, the ancients became kind of sick of Vorgoth's BS and just pushed him off Howling Peak to be killed once and for all by the Shroud. And that very well could be the case. We'll have to wait and see to be sure. But perhaps this actually happened before the main events of the Elixir War, and the ancients actually wanted Vorgoth to become consumed by the Shroud, and part of the Shroud organism. But the ancients are the good guys, right? Well, the ancients are these godlike figures in Enshrouded. Ancient, otherworldly beings that are able to communicate with the flame, just like us, the Flameborn. Most of what we know about them is written onto the obelisks scattered across the world. A note found at a hidden flame shrine at the far south of the map reveals that all of these obelisks were written by someone called Manathor. It isn't explicitly stated, but implied that Manathor was one of these ancients. If you read each of these obelisks, it seems like the ancients are rather divided on this whole human race thing. The younger ancients at least seem to want to protect humanity, but the older Imperium seem to pity our short lives and kind of just want it to be over and done with already. So I definitely wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that the ancients, or at least a group of the ancients, decided to extradite the end humanity process by pushing Vorgoth into the Shroud. And I wouldn't be surprised if this mysterious wanderer who brought the secrets of this elixir to the land turned out to be one of the ancients too. Perhaps this is actually Manathor, who by the end seems to be wrestling with his decisions and his failures. With news of the brewing war, discontentment continues to grow in the capital. Strange noises are heard below the ground in the region's main fortress, Fort Kelvin, while people across Revelwood are going missing. And King Gormander actually does start to take some action here, sending his Royal Inquisitor Lachlan to the town of Glennwood's End, who have ceased all communications with the capital, which probably means they haven't been paying Gormander's taxes. And for those of you paying attention, yes, Glennwood's End was one of the places we mentioned earlier that the mysterious wanderer was spotted wandering mysteriously towards. So we know it's probably not going to go very well. The investigator writes back to inform the king that the town has fallen into ruin, with townspeople neglecting their daily way of life due to the excessive consumption of the elixir. Lachlan writes that he has taken samples from an illegal distillery to study the substance. But the letter is never delivered, and the king is instead sent Lackland's head. This act of rebellion prompted a swift response from King Gormander, who sent soldiers to the town. But with their bodies now strewn across the streets, it seems he may have seriously underestimated the power and ferocity the elixir had granted the townspeople. And it wasn't just here in Glennwood's End. Scavenger rebel groups empowered by the elixir were springing up all over Embervale, wreaking havoc, and maybe nowhere was this chaos most evident than in the Nomad Highlands, a region that seems to have been notorious for corruption and lawlessness even before the elixir. Among the many drawn to the madness of the elixir here were two sisters, Kendall and Lupa, who likely came from Umber Hollow, the lower basin of the Nomad Highlands, now completely swallowed by the Shroud. When Lupa mysteriously vanished, her sister Kendall began searching the region for her. Eventually, Kendall encountered a thief, who revealed to her that Lupa had run into trouble with the leader of a rebel group, known only as the Contractor. The thief told Kendall that the Contractor had imprisoned Lupa, but promised he would be able to get a letter to her. You can find this letter in Lupa's jail cell, in the town of Jasper Isles. Eventually, Kendall managed to track down and confront the Contractor, who told her that Lupa had escaped imprisonment in Jasper Isles, but was now imprisoned in Raven's Keep, which, according to the Carpenter Cade, was because Lupa had drunkenly fought one of his aunts. Kendall killed the Contractor and made her way to Raven's Keep, promising to break Lupa free. At the prison, notes reveal how other inmates were scared of Lupa, whispering of the acidic liquid that leaked from her lips, and calling her matron. Logs also detail an occasion when Lupa had spat on an officer, leaving a burn scar on its cheek. Elsewhere in the world, you can read that this is a sign that someone has infused the elixir straight into their heart. With or without the aid of her sister, Lupa managed to escape Raven's Keep by blasting through the wall of her cell, and vanishing into the adjacent Vuka caves. With the Contractor now dead, the sisters set their sights on seizing power in the region. Kendall took control of Surrat's Rest, while Lupa established her stronghold at Lupa's Lair, a bandit camp overlooking Umber Hollow. Both continue to infuse themselves with the elixir, slowly transforming themselves into the matron gorges that you later face at these locations. But the scavengers were only part of the chaos consuming Embervale. A far greater conflict was coming, not just between scattered rebels and outlaws, but between armies. According to the Guard of the North Gloves, an item found in a chest in Pikemead's Reach, Vorgoth and his army carved their way through the Enshrouded valleys, marching towards the capital. Leading his soldiers through the Shroud, Vorgoth was condemning them to an inevitable fate, their minds slowly falling under the influence of the Shroud hive mind. The first major battle of the Elixir Wars that we know about took place at the Ancient Bridge, and was later known as the Battle by the Bridge. Here, King Gormander's forces made a desperate attempt to defend against the incoming Northern Army, led by the King's own brother, Lord Vorgoth. But Vorgoth's army didn't march alone. With them, they brought the Shroud. Not much is known about the fight itself, only that many of Gormander's men fled at the sight of the approaching Shroud. A note from Athelan the Hunter describes how she ran towards the bridge after the battle, searching for her brother, Commander Talion, only to be met with fleeing soldiers, their eyes wide with terror. They screamed at the Shroud, how it had consumed everything, while Vorgoth's warriors fought on, undeterred. By the time she arrived, the army had already moved on, and there was no sign of her brother. But if you do go down to the battlefield by the bridge, you'll find that her brother is still there, or what remains of him, now fully consumed by the Shroud as a fell thunderbrute. When you finally put this enemy to rest, he will drop the fell commander's bow. Despite this victory, it seems Vorgoth didn't immediately march towards the capital, instead likely deciding to take control of some of the nearby elixir wells. With entire villages consumed by the encroaching Shroud, blue crevasses splitting open beneath them, and an invading army leaving destruction in its wake, many had no choice but to flee. Some sought refuge in the one place they believed to be safe, Fort Kelvin, a stronghold nestled against the cliffs in the heart of the Revelwood, safely up beyond the Shroud's reach. But remember those reports of eerie sounds beneath the fortress? Well, it turns out they weren't just rumours. The Vuka, driven from their underground dwellings by the advancing Shroud, had chosen Fort Kelvin as their new home, and rather than negotiate, they decided to go with a more ritualistic approach, sacrificing the fort's current inhabitants. Not so cute and cuddly now, eh? Among the victims was a man named Jakes, who had been organising the refugees. A letter found at the site reveals that Jakes had once worked for the Pike Weekly, the same bulletin where Ramone Jones served as editor. Addressed to Ramone, the letter describes revisions Jakes had been forced to make in his latest draft. But the letter was never sent, and is found on the pile of corpses. Perhaps it was the chaos of Fort Kelvin that prevented him from sending it. Or maybe, with Ramone still in hiding for treason, there was simply nowhere to send it. At the time, Ramone was still lying low in Pikemead's reach. We know that eventually he found shelter with a man called Henry, who lived in the Shanty Shacks quarter. Henry had recently lost his young son Finian in the battle by the bridge, leaving him with an empty room. In exchange for hiding Ramone, a fugitive wanted for treason, Ramone promised that the local sorcerer owed him a favour, one that might be able to reunite Henry with his lost son. Desperate to see Finian again, Henry eventually sought out the sorcerer for help. But if you head up to the sorcerer's attic, you'll see that something went terribly wrong. Whatever spell was cast didn't work as intended. And Ramone, who is now abandoned in Henry's basement, ultimately perished from dehydration. Ramone is one of the NPC Pure Souls that can be resurrected to your base. Pure Soul, by the way, just means that in life they were never in contact with the Shroud, nor drank even a drip of the elixir. If you save Ramone and bring him some water, he'll thank you by revealing the location of a piece of Queen Pikemead's statue, which King Gormander had ordered to be tossed from the docks. King Gormander knew that Vorgoth's army was coming, and the city had to prepare for a siege. Labourers were sent to patch up crumbling towers and walls, though notes left behind reveal their grim skepticism, with many believing their efforts futile. But a little hope did come to the townspeople when they saw lights dancing through the waters. Many took this as a good omen, that nature was healing, that the waters would soon run clean again, and the war and blight of the elixir would soon come to an end. A few even dared to hope that the late Queen Pikemead would rise from the dead to save them. But I'm sure that hope quickly withered, as the Shroud crept over the horizon towards them, a sign of the approaching army. King Gormander sealed the city gates and withdrew into the inner castle, the Pike, leaving the rest of his people to fend for themselves. As the siege began, the bombardments took their toll. But even as they lay dying, the people cursed King Gormander's name for abandoning them, and willed that he would meet his end at Vorgoth's hand. On the third day of the siege, the enemy's catapults tore through the weakened walls, and the Northern Army, led by Lord Vorgoth, flooded into the city. With them came the Shroud, creeping into every alley and hiding place. A note found next to a skeleton in Huckster Square describes the moment the Northern Army took this part of the city. It mentions Lord Vorgoth removing his glove, revealing a frozen, lifeless-looking hand. The note goes on to describe how the cobblestones beneath Vorgoth split apart, as if he were trying to summon something from below, likely this Shroud root, now standing tall in the courtyard. With the city's outer defences shattered, and the Shroud spreading through its streets, there was little left to stop the army's advance. Eventually they reached the Pike, and King Gormander was slain. What happened to Lord Vorgoth after he seized the capital remains unclear. A recent Reddit AMA with some of the developers mentioned that Vorgoth never made it to the Kindle Wastes as part of his crusade, and was eventually forced to retreat. But speaking of the Kindle Wastes, that's actually where we're turning to next, to Queen Jezmina, who writes in her journal about the news of Vorgoth's attack on Gormander. With famine and drought already making survival in the Kindle Wastes impossible, and now maybe with war on the horizon, Jezmina realizes she must abandon her city of East Lapis and lead her people westward to the lush Springlands. Their ultimate destination is Longkeep, which is the first settlement that we encounter at the start of the game. As the city begins to evacuate, Queen Jezmina decides to ride out ahead of the caravan to the town of Brittlebush, hoping to rally the people there to join them. Her speech manages to inspire the townsfolk, many of whom have already lost almost everything to the drought. Among them is the farmer, Emily Frey, who at this point was running her own tavern in Brittlebush. Moved by the Queen's words, Emily rises in support of the Queen, and the people of Brittlebush agree to join the caravan. As the rest of the caravan from East Lapis arrives, they set up camp west of the town, and although their journey has barely begun, we're already starting to see a few hints about the sparks between Emily and Jezmina. In a letter Queen Jezmina wrote to her commander, Cyrus, she describes Emily as a striking brunette, and it seems the sentiment is mutual when we find a letter from Emily near Jezmina's tent. Inside, Emily encloses a recipe for a dish she had prepared for the Queen, telling her to serve it hot and with love. Pretty saucy. With the people of East Lapis and Brittlebush united, Jezmina and Commander Cyrus led the caravan westward out of the Kendall wastes and into the Nomad Highlands. However, they are not long into this land before the caravan decides to split, with Jezmina taking half of the refugees south and Commander Cyrus taking the other half north. Though no records explain why, it's likely the caravan divided in order to visit more settlements and find more survivors along their route. The northern caravan under Cyrus had plans to stop by Pikemead's Reach, searching for survivors of Vorgoth's assault, while Jezmina's group aims to stop at Surat's Rest, the largest city in the Nomad Highlands. By following each of their paths, we can see their struggles unfold. Soon after the split, the northern caravan decides to take a detour when they spot signs of life at a far-off flame sanctum. This detour takes the best part of a day, and when the group finally arrive, the people there refuse to leave, believing they are safest in the light of the flame. When you visit this location in-game, you'll see that these followers did eventually perish, likely to the scavengers who have since desecrated the flame sanctum. Cyrus's caravan decides to camp at the flame sanctum before retracing their steps westward again. Meanwhile, the southern caravan also stops at a flame sanctum, before reaching Surat's Rest. There, they find the city overrun with scavengers, led by Kendall, one of the sisters we mentioned earlier. Realizing the danger, Jezmina and her people abandon their camp in the middle of the night. It's at this abandoned site that we find the first of Emily's love letters to Jezmina, revealing that her feelings have deepened. Amid the hurried departure, she also leaves behind her almanac, which the scavengers manage to recover. Emily later asks us to retrieve it for her, and to do so, we must face Kendall herself in the arena at the top of Surat's Rest. Continuing westward, Jezmina's caravan enters a canyon near the Pillars of Creation, unknowingly crossing into New Vuka territory. In the night, they are ambushed by the Vuka, suffering heavy casualties. Jezmina fights to defend her people, but she loses her axe in the battle, a weapon that can be later looted by defeating the Vuka brawler at this location. At around the same time, the northern caravan was pushing through a town called Rattlebleak, but from here, the caravan's exact route to Pikemead's Reach is uncertain. I tried really hard to map out all of the roads in this region to try and work out which route they may have taken, and it seems to me that they had very few options to get down to Pikemead's Reach, unless they wanted to risk going through one of the cave passages, or maybe head through the mines. Well, however they managed to get there, once they do finally reach their next camp, Pikemead's Reach is now within sight. But something is wrong. Despite no records of recent combat in the area, the city smolders in the distance. Holding out hope for survivors, Cyrus leads a group into what remains of the city. Among them is Raoul, a friend of Emily's, to whom she entrusted her kettle to when the caravan split. In one of her quests, she'll ask you to retrieve it from him, and say hi to him for her. Yeah, I'm sure he's probably fine. You can find the kettle in Pikemead's Flame Sanctum, alongside what remains of Raoul, and several others from the caravan. Nearby, a note recounts what happened to them. As they entered the city, the group were ambushed by a volley of arrows, severely wounding several of the group, and scattering them. Luckily, they managed to regroup with Commander Cyrus by nightfall, just as the Fel began creeping into the city. Seeking refuge, they barricaded themselves into the sanctum, believing the holy light would keep the Fel at bay. Commander Cyrus, however, seems to have pressed on towards the pike. There, the lights in the water, once thought to be a good omen, revealed their true nature, a brood of wisp wyverns that had now been infected and corrupted by the Shroud. Decades later, you fight one of these, now adult Fel wisp wyvern, at the pike, and upon its defeat, it will drop the Commander's ring, suggesting that Cyrus didn't survive the encounter. Elsewhere in the world, Balthazar the Alchemist seems almost consumed by despair, wondering how humanity can possibly endure with all that's happened. He believes that the only hope left lies in the flame. Eventually, it seems like Balthazar's prayers were answered. A note found near the Low Meadows ancient spire reveals that the ancient spoke to Balthazar and told him of a plan to guide an ancient flame into a human shell. This would create a being far more resilient against the Shroud, and capable of fighting it. This is of course the Flameborn they're talking about. Us. We haven't really talked much about the Flame or the Flameborn yet so far in this video. That's really because we don't know all that much. The flame seems to be this sort of sentient, all-knowing power or force within the world. We know that those who attempt to steal its power for themselves become the Hollow. These cursed ones are cast out by their communities, and withdraw to the Hollow Halls, where they live amongst others who share their fate. It seems that very few beings are able to communicate and understand the flame, notably us, the Flameborn, and the Ancients. The other survivors that you awaken from the ancient vaults, such as the blacksmith, farmer, hunter, are not Flameborn like the player. Instead, they are fully human, placed into a deep, timeless slumber to eventually be awakened by the Flameborn. Near the blacksmith's ancient vault, you can find records of Balthazar's experiments in creating these vessels, perhaps modifying them from those created by the Ancients. After many attempts, he finally succeeded. The subject would be dead, yet alive, untouched by decay, and immune to the passage of time. According to Balthazar's journal, the blacksmith was the first human to enter slumber within one of these cinder vessels. Jumping back to Queen Jezmina and what remains of the Southern Caravan, they finally managed to escape the canyon, and now with the worst behind them, they have reached the Springlands. They rest some time in Hillock, still heavily wounded from the Vuka attack, before continuing southwest along the road, stopping again just south of the Springlands ancient spire. Their destination, Longkeep, is now within sight, but Jezmina senses that she won't be able to rest for long, that there's something else she needs to do. When the caravan finally reaches Longkeep, a letter from Emily confirms Jezmina's premonitions were right. The Ancients have summoned her to stay behind while the rest of the caravan slumbers in the Cinder Vault. Emily is devastated by this, and pleads with Jezmina not to leave them, but we know that she does. While the others descend into a deep sleep within the Cinder Vaults, Queen Jezmina sets off north, drawn by the call of the Ancients. Yet, considering we find Emily quite some distance from Longkeep, it seems that she might have tried to follow Jezmina, or at the very least, decided not to slumber in the Cinder Vaults with the rest of the caravan. The next we hear of Queen Jezmina, she has travelled deep into the Blackmire, a lush jungle sub-region of the Revelwood. There, she writes of her mission, to scatter cinder vessels across Embervale for every soul who cannot reach the Springlands in time. She is being guided on this quest by the Ancients, who, once her task is complete, will send a signal to the worthy, although she doesn't quite know what this means at this point. Her journey eventually leads her to the sunken ancient city, a long-forgotten structure once built by the Ancients. In its main hall, she places a cinder vessel, and then watches as the Ancients gather around it, chanting in their ancient tongue. A celestial message is sent out, one meant for the worthy. In this particular case, this call is meant for the bard, Valerie, who we will one day awaken from this ancient vault deep in the Blackmire, decades later. It's very difficult to gauge when these different things were happening. Would it have killed these people to date their letters? But where we next pick up the story, it seems that some time has passed, and the Shroud has now encroached some distance into the Springlands, making travel around these parts very difficult. The Ancients were now preparing to close the Cinder Vaults. Captain Arkwright, who has not been mentioned up until now and is not mentioned anywhere else in the game, to my knowledge, was entrusted by the Ancients with defending the main vault at Longkeep. Before leaving, the Ancients led a handful of his finest warriors into the vault, presumably to also place them into slumber within the cinder vessels. Notes scattered across the starting region detail how Arkwright and his remaining men fought to defend the vault against Scavenger attacks. The Scavengers were attacking from across Balin Bridge, so as a last resort, Arkwright ordered the bridge be blown up. And it worked. But in doing so, they had also cut off their line to supplies, and would soon face starvation. In a desperate attempt to find food, Arkwright and his men decided to take their chances in the Shroud. But it seems they didn't make it very far. If you head down into the Shroud from Longkeep, you can loot Captain Arkwright's ring from what remains of him. But at least by blowing up the bridge, they were able to protect the Cinder Vault from the Scavengers, which cannot be said for most of the other Cinder Vaults around Embervale. As for the few worthy ones summoned by the Ancients to the cinder vessels scattered across Embervale, the only detailed account we have is that of the bard Valerie. In the Blackmire, letters recount her journey to the sunken ancient city. Valerie writes of following a bright star that tore through the Shroud's haze long ago. She notes that while only a few survivors remain, none of them can see the star that she can. Eventually, she reaches the sunken city and discovers a letter left by Queen Jezmina, whom she once met as a child. Trusting in the call of the Ancients and in Queen Jezmina, Valerie enters slumber within the vessel, awaiting the day that she'll be awakened. The same celestial signal also likely went out to the other worthy ones, guiding them to the vaults that we later rescued them from. But what about the ones who didn't make it to the Springlands vaults in time, or weren't deemed one of the worthy ones? A caravan from the Kendall wastes eventually reaches the town of Woodguard, likely the last remnants of Cyrus's northern caravan. There, they join refugees from across Embervale, all seeking safety in the Springlands. For reasons unknown, the caravan, or at least some of its members, decide not to continue on to Longkeep, their original destination, despite only being a few towns away. Perhaps they believed that they were finally safe, beyond the Shroud's reach. Or maybe the ever-growing Shroud and roaming Scavenger groups had already cut them off from heading further south. Among the notes found in Woodguard is the story of Salim, a survivor from the caravan who was healed by Helen, a refugee from the mountains. Salim compares Helen to a daffodil, the first sign of spring, but Helen sees things differently. She knows that he is naive to think the worst is over, and writes that he's a fool, but a sweet one. Of course, if you visited Woodguard in game, you'll know that Helen was right. Woodguard would not survive, and the Shroud would eventually consume most of the town. Salim's final note can be found in a flame sanctum, overlooking the Springlands. In it, he seems to have finally accepted their fate. Please hold your tears and sit by my side. Let us gaze over the valley, as we've done before. The setting sun and falling leaves are like our brief and precious time. Let us share these hours before they're swept away by the Shroud. And this is just one of many tragic stories that you can read about in Enshrouded, but this one in particular also gives its name to probably my favourite piece of music from the game, The Fool and the Daffodil. So that is by no means everything from Enshrouded's lore, but hopefully gives you enough context to understand what happened to this world before the game, and what or who to look out for in future updates, especially with the game's 1.0 release coming early 2026. It is genuinely so impressive how in-depth this lore goes, and how much I could have added to this video, and I really can't wait to see where they take it next. As for what's ahead, I do have a couple of thoughts. We know that King Gormander is dead, but I suspect that we'll meet both of his siblings later on in the game. Jezmina is likely sealed away in a Cinder vault somewhere, waiting for us to wake her, while I'm sure we'll encounter some fell Vorgoth lurking deep in the Shroud, either as a major late game boss, or maybe even as the final endgame boss. Unless of course they're saving that spot for one of the Ancient Imperium, who I definitely suspect probably started this mess. But what do you think? Where do you think the story is heading next? Let me know in the comments below, and check out this video to find out about Valheim's lore. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, you're incredible. Please like if you liked, and subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Until the next one,